27 years ago, an entire class of young students vanished during a school trip, disappearing without a trace and leaving their families devastated. Authorities suspected that the male teacher, who had disappeared with the group, was involved. However, with no bodies found and few leads to follow, the investigation eventually went cold. Yet, throughout these long, agonizing years, one desperate mother never gave up hope. Clinging to the small chance that her daughter might still be out there somewhere, she maintained her vigil. Then, one day, while carefully examining old photographs, she noticed a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked, a detail that would change the entire case and shock everyone involved in ways no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this shocking story, let's share the background of the day that changed everything. Emily Johnson awoke on the morning of September 28th, 2023, with a heavy heart. The gray, cloudy sky outside her window perfectly mirrored her somber mood. Though she had prepared herself for this day, the grief and heartache were overwhelming. After all, it had been exactly 27 years since her daughter, Ava, had disappeared. Slowly, Emily rose from her bed and made her way to her dressing table, where a close-up photo of Ava in her school uniform hung on the mirror. Gently cradling the photo in her hands, her eyes welled up with tears as she gazed at her daughter's smiling face and whispered, "Oh, Ava," even as her voice cracked with emotion. Yet, determined to hold herself together, Emily quickly took a deep breath and steeled herself against the wave of sorrow that threatened to engulf her. She had endured the worst of times over the past 27 years and knew she must remain strong. After washing her face and getting dressed, Emily checked her phone and saw a reassuring text from her dear friend Grace Martin. "You're not alone in this. All of us still remember. If you need company, come over to my place anytime." Grace, who is also the mother of one of the vanished children, had been a constant source of comfort through her own grief. Emily replied to Grace's message, asking if it would be okay to come over immediately. Grace's response was immediate and warm, inviting her in without hesitation. Before leaving, Emily went into her kitchen to gather a few packets of Earl Grey with lavender tea and a jar of cookies from her collection, a small but meaningful gesture that felt necessary even after so many years of friendship. As she stepped out of her house and began the short walk to Grace's, she reflected on the loneliness she had experienced since losing her husband. Grace had become one of the few people who truly understood her pain and had stood by her during the darkest times. The familiar neighborhood, with houses that looked much the same as they had 27 years ago, provided a bittersweet contrast to how much her life had changed. Arriving at Grace's home, a few blocks from her own, Emily noticed the front door open even before she could knock. Grace greeted her with a warm, understanding smile and enveloped her in a comforting hug as she softly said, "Come in." Handing over the cookie jar and tea packets, Emily joined Grace in the kitchen, where Grace busied herself with boiling water for the tea while Emily settled onto the living room sofa. The familiar surroundings offered a small measure of solace on this difficult day, and as they waited for the water to boil, Grace gently asked, "How are you doing?" With downcast eyes, Emily sighed, "I'm trying to keep up. You know how it is. This day is always the hardest." She paused to gather her thoughts and added, "Even though I've learned to live with it, the past still haunts me, especially today." Grace nodded in understanding, admitting, "It's the same for me." Grace recalled completing her therapy last year, having accepted the past, and tried to reconcile all the what-ifs that might have eaten her alive. Yet, she confessed that this day was particularly hard, leaving her unsure if she needed to return to therapy. As the kettle whistled and Grace poured the hot water into 2 cups, the comforting aroma of Earl Grey and lavender filled the air and offered a brief, peaceful moment amid their shared grief. Sipping their tea together, Emily felt deeply grateful for Grace's presence. Over the years, their bond had grown through their shared tragedy. In those moments, the weight of their loss hung heavy, yet there was also a powerful sense of solidarity, a reminder that even in the depths of sorrow, one is never truly alone. Grace set her teacup down and smiled gently, sharing a piece of wisdom from her psychologist. We should face our pain whenever it comes and accept it as part of ourselves, not try to hide or bypass it. After a brief pause, she suggested, I was thinking maybe we could look at some photos together if you're up for it. Emily, letting the warm tea soothe her, nodded softly, and Grace retrieved a photo album from the TV cabinet. Sitting close together on the sofa, they began to flip through the pages. A flood of memories washed over them as the photos chronicled happier times. Children's first days of school, birthday parties, and family picnics. Their voices mixed laughter with tears as they recalled. Do you remember when Ava and Isabella first started at that school? Emily asked, pointing to a picture of the two girls in their uniforms. Grace, with a wistful smile, confirmed, Grade 5, wasn't it? The school had only been open for 2 years at that point. Emily replied, That's right. I remember how small the class was at first, just 6 students, but by the end of that year it had grown to 15. The school really put a lot of effort into marketing with all those discounted fees to attract parents. They continued to flip through the album when Emily's eye was suddenly drawn to a photo she had never seen before, a picture showing Ava, Isabella, and some of their classmates working on a science project during the school fair. The children's faces shone with enthusiasm, completely unaware of the impending tragedy. This picture, it's beautiful, Emily whispered. Where did you get it from? Grace explained, I received it from the police a few months ago. Since the case went cold, they allowed parents to collect copies of evidence materials. I went to the station and requested everything they had. Emily, surprised, remarked, I didn't know we could do that. If I had known, I would have asked for copies too. Grace gave a sad smile and added, maybe it's better that you didn't. To be honest, having all this evidence has made it harder for me to move on. It's part of why I needed therapy. I spent so many sleepless nights poring over those files, looking for anything that might give us answers. As they continued looking through the photos, Emily came across another unfamiliar image, a class picture taken in front of a bright yellow school bus, the very bus that had taken the children on that fateful trip. Studying the photo intently, her eyes scanned each face until she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. With a voice filled with confusion and a hint of hope, she asked, Why is Principal Margaret Evans in this picture? I thought Mr. Thompson, the classroom teacher, went alone with the kids and just one support staff member that day. Leaning in closer to inspect the photo, Grace replied, I'm not entirely sure. I remember hearing rumors from other parents that the staff member was actually the principal, but never gave it much thought. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right after all these years. She had always believed that it was just the teacher and a coworker or administrative staff on that trip. The presence of the principal in this photo raised questions she had never considered before. Just as Emily opened her mouth to voice her concerns, Grace gently placed a hand on her arm and said, I know that look in your eyes. We've been down this road before, thinking we found something crucial dozens if not hundreds of times. It's not good for us to cling to false hope. Though a part of Emily still clung to the nagging doubt that this detail could be important, she took a deep breath and finally murmured, You're right. It's probably nothing. Grace then pointed to the bus in the background of the photo and added, This photo was most likely taken before the trip on school grounds, which would explain why the principal was there. Emily nodded slowly, though not entirely convinced, and glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing that they had been talking for nearly an hour. Reluctantly, Grace rose and said, I hate to do this, but I should probably get going. I want to visit Ava's grave, bring her some flowers, and tidy up a bit. I do it every year. Emily appreciated the offer when Grace suggested, Would you like some company? Isabella's grave is in the same area. Although touched by the gesture, Emily saw a hesitation in Grace's eyes and replied, That's kind of you, but I know you prefer to go with James later. I'll be all right. Before leaving, Emily paused and turned back to Grace, asking, Would it be all right if I took that photo with me? The one with the school bus? After a moment's consideration, Grace nodded and said, Of course, but promise me you won't let this consume you. We can't afford to go down that rabbit hole again. As Emily left Grace's house and made her way to the bus stop, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something important. The image of Principal Evans standing with the children before their ill-fated trip burned in her mind like a puzzle piece that did not quite fit with the story she had been told for 27 long years. Waiting for the bus that would take her to town to buy flowers from her favorite local florist, Emily found herself torn between the desire to uncover the truth and the fear of reopening old wounds. The sky grew darker, threatening rain, much like the storm of emotions brewing within her, and she silently prayed that the rain would hold off until she had finished her visit to the cemetery, allowing her a day to honor her daughter's memory in peace. Lost in thought on the bus, Emily clutched the photo tightly to her chest. The steady rhythm of rain against the pavement provided a backdrop to her swirling thoughts and questions. The encounter with Principal Evans had left her with more doubts than answers. She could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. As the bus wound its way through rain-slicked streets, she pulled out her phone in hopes of a missed call from the police officer assigned to the case. Yet, the screen remained blank. When her stop came into view, she disembarked into a light drizzle and walked toward a colorful florist shop, a stark contrast to the gray day. Pausing under the awning of a nearby shop, she hesitated for a moment, debating whether to call again, wondering if it would even make a difference after her conversation with the principal. But no matter how hard she tried to push the unsettling image of the nervous principal and the mysterious young woman from her mind, it persisted. Deciding she had waited long enough, Emily took a deep breath and ran to the florist shop, holding her purse over her head as a makeshift umbrella. The cold rain clung to her skin and seeped through her clothes, yet she barely noticed. It was a small price to pay for the comfort of warm, fragrant air. As she pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell overhead announced her arrival. Immediately, the scent of fresh flowers, a soothing blend of roses, enveloped her, and a kindly florist named Sarah greeted her, saying, "Mrs. Johnson, I was wondering if we'd see you today." Emily managed a small smile and replied, "Hello, Sarah. Yes, I'm here for my usual order." While Sarah gathered the flowers, Emily scanned the shop selection. The variety was less extensive than in previous years, and a twinge of disappointment passed over her. Noticing her expression, Sarah apologized. "I'm sorry we don't have as much variety this year. The weather's been unpredictable, and it has affected our suppliers." Emily nodded in understanding. "It's all right, Sarah. I'm sure we can still put together something beautiful for Ava." As Sarah continued gathering the blooms, the door's bell chimed once more. Emily turned to see her dear friend Grace, accompanied by her husband James, entering the shop. Their eyes met, and for a moment, surprise and then concern flashed across Grace's face. Approaching Grace warmly, Emily said, "Grace, I thought you'd have gone to the florist earlier. Are you all right?" Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to share about her impromptu visit to Principal Evans's house, and finally admitted, "I got a bit sidetracked, but it's good to see you both again." James shook Emily's hand warmly and said, "It's good to see you too, Emily. How are you holding up?" Before Emily could answer, Sarah returned with an armful of flowers and said, "Here you are, Mrs. Johnson. Would you like to arrange them yourself, as usual?" Emily nodded gratefully. "Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'll do that." As she carefully arranged the flowers, selecting each stem with care, Grace and James chose their own bouquets for Isabella's grave. In the quiet shop, the soft rustling of paper and gentle murmurs filled the space as Emily's mind wandered back to her earlier encounter with Principal Evans. Should she tell Grace about her suspicions? Would her friend understand, or think that Emily was merely grasping at ghosts of the past? After tying a ribbon around her bouquet, Emily noticed Grace watching her with a mixture of affection and concern. "That's beautiful, Emily," Grace softly said, adding, "Ava would have loved it." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes at the mention of her daughter's name, and she managed a quiet, "Thank you. I hope so." The three of them then made their way to the counter to pay for their flowers as Sarah carefully wrapped Grace's bouquet. Stepping back onto the sidewalk, the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. James suggested, "Let's all go to the cemetery together," and Emily, though heavy with emotion, nodded in agreement. In the car, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. Grace turned to Emily with genuine concern and asked, "Emily, why did you go to see Principal Evans? What were you hoping to find?" Clutching the bouquet in her lap, Emily took a deep breath and said, "I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about that class photo, the one with the school bus." Grace's brow furrowed as she recalled. "That's the one we looked at earlier. You mentioned it was taken at the school before the trip, but Principal Evans at first said it was taken during the trip, then quickly corrected herself and said it was before. Don't you find that strange? It felt as though the principal was hiding something," Emily explained, her voice growing more animated as the weight of suspicion pressed harder on her chest. James glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression neutral, and remarked, "It's been 27 years. Memory can play tricks on us, especially with such a traumatic event." Emily acknowledged his point but insisted, I know, but there was something else. When I arrived at her house, there was a young woman there, someone I'd never seen before, and the principal appeared nervous, almost as if she didn't want that woman to know what we were talking about." Grace and James exchanged a look that Emily couldn't quite decipher. After a prolonged silence, Grace spoke gently yet firmly. "I understand the need to find answers, Emily. Believe me, I do. But we've been down this road before. Remember 3 years ago when you thought you'd found a connection between the bus driver and that cold case in Oregon?" Emily felt a flush of embarrassment at that memory. She had spent weeks convinced she'd uncovered a vital clue only to have it lead nowhere. "This is different," she insisted, though a small part of her wondered if she was trying to convince herself as much as her friends. As the car wound its way through the familiar streets toward the cemetery, Emily watched the town gradually give way to rural surroundings. The sky cleared slightly, revealing patches of blue between the clouds, and as they approached the cemetery gates, James broke the silence. "Emily, we care about you. We don't want to see you get hurt again by false hope." With a lump forming in her throat, Emily softly replied, "I know. I just can't help the feelings. Ava, Isabella, and all the others deserve more than just acceptance. They deserve the truth." Grace squeezed her hand gently, and while James parked the car, Emily felt a mix of familiar grief, persistent hope, and a new determination. She realized that her encounter with Principal Evans had opened a door that had long been closed. Stepping into the cool, damp air outside, the scent of freshly turned earth lingering around them, they made their way through the cemetery. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness, and their footsteps were muffled by the soft ground as they approached the graves of Ava and Isabella, placed close together as a small comfort in their shared grief. Emily knelt at Ava's tombstone, placing the bouquet of flowers gently at its base. The fresh petals, still glistening with morning dew, added a burst of color against the gray stone. Running her fingers over the engraved name, she felt the pain of an empty grave, a place meant for closure, yet haunted by the absence of Ava's remains. With a quiet sigh, Emily reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photograph. Studying her daughter's face, her fingers absent-mindedly brushed over the image, and the ache in her chest deepened as memories flooded back. Ava's laughter, the way she tugged at her sleeve for attention, and the bittersweet memory of their last goodbye. Tears spilled over as Emily allowed herself to grieve freely, her sobs a testament to the pain of that fateful day. After a while, as the weight of sorrow eased just enough to let her breathe, Emily wiped her tears and slowly stood up. Glancing toward Grace and James, who stood by Isabella's grave in quiet mourning, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to join her friends. But just as she was about to approach, something caught her eye. In the distance, near a plot where most of the missing school children were buried, she saw a familiar figure, the young woman from Principal Evans's house. The woman was not merely passing through. She stood still, staring down at a headstone, her hands clasped together in quiet contemplation. Emily's pulse quickened. Was it mere coincidence or something more? Setting her grief aside momentarily, Emily moved toward the woman. As she approached, she noticed the stranger was crying, her shoulders shaking as she stood in front of one of the graves. "Excuse me," Emily called softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman looked up, surprise and fear flashing across her face as she quickly wiped her tears, as though trying to compose herself. "We meet again," Emily said steadily. "I think I saw you at Principal Evans's house earlier." The young woman lowered her eyes, shifting uncomfortably as if wishing to retreat. "I'm sorry," she added quickly. "I don't mean to intrude." Then, in a quiet voice, she murmured, "I come here every year on this day to grieve." Emily nodded in understanding and, after a moment, gently asked, "Who are you grieving for? Were you related to one of the students who went missing 27 years ago?" The woman hesitated, her lips parting slightly before pressing together, as if considering her answer. Then, almost reluctantly, she nodded. Emily sensed her unease, but did not press further. As her eyes drifted toward a small framed photograph near the grave, a faded image of a young girl, Emily saw the woman quickly pick it up, clutching it tightly to her chest. "I'm sorry," the woman said softly. "I didn't mean to invade your privacy. You must have really loved and missed your sister. I understand that feeling." Taking a step back so as not to cause further distress, Emily was about to leave when the woman called out, "Wait." The unexpected question caught Emily off guard, and she turned fully to face the stranger. With a measured tone, Emily asked, "Why did you go to Principal Evans's house earlier? You can't be her daughter." "I know Principal Evans doesn't have a daughter." The question hung heavy in the air, with unspoken implications. The woman's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment it felt as if the world had paused, both caught in a web of secrets and unspeakable truths. After a long pause, the woman finally relented in a barely audible whisper, "You're right. I'm one of the missing students, a survivor." Emily's heart raced in disbelief as the woman continued, "My name is Audrey Davis." Recognition flooded over Emily. Audrey's name had been etched into the tombstone that she had seen during countless visits, a haunting reminder of the tragedy when Ava was in her class. Struggling to process the weight of Audrey's words, Emily asked, "Did your family know you were alive?" Audrey shook her head, her expression heavy with pain. "No, that's why I come to the grave later in the day. My parents always come in the morning." Emily recalled the many times she had seen Audrey's parents at the cemetery, their faces etched with grief, and softly inquired, "Why didn't you come back home?" Audrey's voice trembled as she replied, "I'm too broken." Emily's heart ached for this young woman burdened by a past she couldn't escape. "You don't have to share everything with me," Emily said gently, "but please, please, I'm begging you, turn yourself into the police. Give them your testimony and evidence." Audrey shook her head vehemently, replying, "No, no, no. The principal said it would only hurt everyone." Shocked by the mention of Principal Evans, Emily's mind raced. "I trusted her," she confessed in a trembling voice. "Why would she do that?" Audrey's voice cracked as she admitted, "I was the only one who understood my pain." A surge of emotion overtook Emily, and Audrey continued, "The pain of living in the unknown is unbearable. Your testimony could help us, save us all, by revealing the truth." Emily, her heart aching for the lost children, nodded fervently. "Yes, you will be helping the victims' families," she urged. After a prolonged silence, during which the impact of Emily's words sank in, Audrey took a deep breath and reached for her phone. "You're right," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I've wrestled with this decision for so long. Principal Evans always discouraged me, and I believe she had her reasons, but seeing you here now, I'll call the police." At that moment, as Audrey's phone rang, Emily's heart pounded even faster. The distant wail of police sirens pierced the air, and Audrey's eyes filled with both fear and resolve. Suddenly, Grace and James approached, their eyes scanning the area as the tension thickened. "What's going on?" Grace asked, looking between Emily and the stranger. Emily took a deep breath and introduced, "This is Audrey Davis. She was on the bus that day. She's alive." As Audrey began to explain, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, freezing the moment. Audrey's instincts urged her to flee, but Emily's firm, compassionate voice broke through the chaos. "Audrey, If you love Ava and Isabella, you owe it to them to tell the truth. After a few moments, Audrey's resolve hardened. Okay, she finally said, her voice trembling yet resolute. I'll talk, but at the station. Just then, 2 police officers arrived, their presence infusing the scene with urgency. They approached Audrey and confirmed her identity with a series of careful questions. "What's your name?" one officer asked. Audrey replied steadily, "Davis. I am one of the survivors of the missing children from 27 years ago." The officers exchanged glances, radioed for a system check on her name, and, after confirming her identity, instructed everyone, "We need everyone to come with us to the station. We can't have any disturbances here." Audrey, pale but determined, followed the officers. Emily, Grace, and James then made their way to their own car, their hearts racing with adrenaline and anticipation. Once inside, Emily recounted everything to her friends in a trembling voice. Everything from the revelation about Audrey to the startling knowledge that a survivor had been hidden in plain sight, as if the entire mystery were a sinister puzzle with missing pieces. James frowned deeply and said, "This is all so strange. Why would the principal keep something like that from us?" Emily admitted, "I don't know, but it feels like there's something deeper at play. Whatever truth Audrey holds must be significant enough to put Principal Evans in danger." When they arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was tense with uncertainty. Emily spotted Officer Jensen, the very same officer she had tried to reach earlier, and he approached them apologetically, saying, "I'm sorry I couldn't take your call. I was tied up with an urgent case." Emily's frustration mixed with urgency as she implored, "Officer, you need to take this seriously. Audrey has confessed that she is a survivor and is finally ready to talk." Officer Jensen's demeanor shifted to focus, and he motioned for Audrey to follow him into an interview room, leaving Emily, Grace, and James waiting anxiously in the sterile waiting area. As the door closed behind Audrey, Emily felt a surge of hope mingled with fear. She could only pray that Audrey would summon the courage to speak the truth, finally bringing some answers, and perhaps closure, to all the families affected by the tragedy. Not long after, movement within the police station became apparent. Officers bustled about as commands were shouted, and a unit was dispatched to Principal Evans's house with an arrest notice. Hope flickered in Emily's chest as she exchanged glances with Grace and James. This was it. Audrey must have shared everything she knew with the officers. Soon, the sharp sound of police sirens sliced through the air once again, and less than an hour later, officers returned leading a handcuffed Principal Evans into the station. With her head bowed and shoulders slumped under the weight of her circumstances, Principal Evans mumbled, "I'm sorry," as her eyes met those of Emily, Grace, and James. The officers, with unwavering authority, guided her toward the booking area while hours seemed to crawl by in the tense silence. Eventually, an officer entered the room where Audrey was being questioned. Emily leaned in close, straining to catch snippets of the muffled conversation. She heard the officer mention that Principal Evans's statement was ready and that she had confessed the whole truth. Soon after, the officer beckoned Emily, Grace, and James into the interrogation room. There, seated with a mixture of relief and apprehension on her face, Audrey was questioned in detail. The officer explained in a steady, somber voice that Principal Evans had confessed during her interrogation. He revealed that the principal had organized the entire class trip and had framed Mr. Thompson to take the fall for the unspeakable events that occurred. Under immense pressure, with debts mounting and dangerous loan sharks looming, Principal Evans had conspired with the kidnappers. The trip to Big Bend Park had been sabotaged, resulting in the driver's death, whose body had never been found in the initial investigation. Then, the teacher and the children were abducted and transported to a border area in Mexico, where all the kids were trafficked and smuggled into another country. The children were forced into organ trafficking, while the male students were sold overseas for child labor. As the officer's grim words hung in the air, Emily's stomach twisted in knots at the horrifying reality of the situation. Glancing at Grace and James, who looked equally stunned, Emily listened as Audrey suddenly spoke up. I was the only one who made it out alive, Audrey whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of memories. 12 years ago, I managed to escape from the man who had purchased me and forced me into exploitation. Even after getting away, I was too traumatized and mentally destroyed to face my parents. Her eyes flickered with a mixture of shame and pain as she continued. That's when I somehow connected with Principal Evans. She helped me build a new life, paid for my apartment, and cover my living expenses, but in return, I couldn't tell anyone the truth. She claimed it would only add to the distress of the victims' families. Emily's heart raced as she tried to fathom the emotional manipulation that had kept Audrey silent for so long. What about the other children? Did anyone else survive? She asked desperately. Audrey shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I honestly don't know about the others. We were mostly split up. But I remember clearly that Ava died the day of the kidnapping from an overdose they gave her, and Isabella was next. They didn't even get the dosage right for her. At these words, Emily and Grace broke down in tears, their grief crashing over them like a tidal wave. Audrey's voice cracked as she murmured, I'm so sorry, and added, this is what I fear the most. Principal Evans was right, but Emily, wiping away her tears, shook her head firmly and said, Audrey, you did the right thing. This is painful, yes, but now we finally have closure. We can start healing. The police, having listened intently, then explained that with this new evidence they would reopen the case immediately. Charges would be filed against Principal Evans, and authorities in Mexico had already been contacted to pursue the new information. Audrey, the officer said compassionately, we recognize the immense trauma you have endured. While we cannot hold you accountable for withholding information, we must offer you witness protection since the investigation into the trafficking ring will undoubtedly be dangerous. His eyes softened as he looked at Emily, Grace, and James, adding, I know this must be incredibly difficult for you to have hope rekindled after all these years. Emily, tears welling up once more, whispered, at least now we know. After all these years, we finally know what happened to our children. The other victims' families deserve to know too. The police assured everyone they would contact all affected families now that the case was being reopened. As the officers prepared to leave the station, Audrey emerged from the interview room, looking exhausted, yet with a lightness that suggested a great weight had been lifted. Thank you, she said to Emily, her voice thick with emotion, for believing me and for helping me find the courage to come forward. You've given us all a chance at closure. Emily embraced her tightly, feeling a deep connection with this young woman who had survived unimaginable horrors. Thank you for telling the truth, Emily whispered. You've given us all a chance to heal. Stepping out of the police station into the fading light of day, Emily, Grace, and James experienced a strange mixture of emotions. There was grief, a fresh wave of sorrow for the daughter Emily had lost, but also a sense of peace, as if a chapter that had remained open for far too long was finally closing. As they stood together in the parking lot, Grace asked softly, what now? Emily looked up at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear and said in a steady voice, we honor our children's memory by ensuring that justice is served and by helping Audrey build the new life she was denied for so long. As they made their way home, Emily felt a shift within herself. The grief remained a constant companion after all these years, but now it was joined by a newfound determination, a determination to fight for the truth, for Ava, for Isabella, for all the children lost that day, and for Audrey who had survived against all odds. With every step, she silently vowed to keep fighting until the full truth was known and those responsible were held accountable. The road ahead would be long and undoubtedly painful. But for the first time in 27 years, Emily felt as though she was finally on the path to answers and perhaps, eventually, to a kind of peace she had long thought out of reach. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video, and check out others you might have missed. See you next time.